Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. In addition to being a gamer, I have been a junior high history teacher for the last 17 years. I know, as my students say, I'm old. And we just finished up our unit on medieval Europe. And the kids are going through state testing, and can be kind of a stressful time of the school year. So I thought it would be cool to kind of do a combo class project / something that could also serve as a hobby project. So we are going to do a class project of building a castle. And it's not necessarily meant to be one specific castle, but incorporating different elements of castles. So part of our unit of medieval Europe, we studied castles a bit. And the idea behind this project is that kids will be able to work on it. All the kids, I have 150 students. All the kids will be working on it, obviously not at once, but throughout the day, which is how they come to my class anyways, but even throughout the class time, kind of rotating kids in and out of the project. So at times kids will be working on an assignment and then they'll have their turn to come in and work on the castle. But the castle is actually going to be big enough that I think somewhere between 8 to 10 kids, maybe 12. We'll see how it actually works once we get our hands on the project, but we'll be able to work on it all at the same time. But this is essentially the castle design here. So on this particular diagram, one grid, one square on the graph paper represents 1 inch. So, yes, I will point out that we are essentially making this to 28 millimeter scale. And although this will be displayed in the classroom when it's done, it potentially could, of course, come home on weekends if it needs to be stormed by some orcs or, serve for a centerpiece for a D&D adventure or whatever the case may be. And then returns to school on Monday. So definitely getting a twofer out of this one. But here are essentially the key elements here. On the 4 corners here, we have 4 towers. And these are 6 inches by 6 inches. And the height of these 4 towers is 10.5 inches. And we have the main castle door here, which is roughly 6 inches across. It's going to be double doors. And 2 adjacent towers to that. These are smaller towers. They're 3 inch by 3 inch, roughly the same 10.5 inch height of the outer towers. But rather than having a spot where is open and you can see soldiers standing there, this is going to actually have a roof and come to a point here on these particular 2 towers. I think that will have a cool look. We have this area here. The height of this is 6.75 inches. So that'll also be, the outer walls will be slightly taller than that because you'll have the elevated area that soldiers would stand behind. And then in the center castle here, we have an even higher portion. So it's kind of like a keep within a keep, kind of a fill here. So this portion here is another 9.75 inches in height. Now, of course, you have to add that to the previous level, 6.75. So this level right here is going to total out to be 16.5 inches tall. And then there's this kind of great hall here on top of that center keep here, almost like the third keep. You have to kind of break into the castle by levels here. But this is going to have another 6 inches of height plus the height of the roof, which is going to be roughly 4 inches. So total height here, you're talking about the highest point, probably 26.5 inches tall. The dimensions of the whole structure you have from this port of the castle to this portion is 30 inches. And then this portion to this portion is 27. So it's kind of got a rectangular feel to that. And the reason for that mainly is knowing where this is going to be displayed in my classroom, that kind of makes the most sense, those dimensions for the base. So yeah, the doors, there's going to be a door here into this great hall, a door here into this portion of the keep that will be visible from the exterior. And then, a lot of stuff going on the inside, of course. I'm thinking probably in these towers here, having like a trapdoor, pull door here. And then the roof is still in play. Some of this might change as we're building it. These right here are designed to be like these buttresses on the back. I thought that would be a cool element as well. All right, well, we'll show you pictures of the build as it's coming together. This particular project might include a lot of pictures as opposed to film because A lot of the work will be occurring during class time, and I'm not going to be running the film, although taking pictures I think is fine. So looking forward to getting you some more updates on this build. This build is going to come out in a little bit of an episodic nature, so probably 4 or 5 videos to show you the whole process. And then the students are going to be painting this thing. So, you know, we have some great artists. So I have no doubt that they probably actually can paint this better than I would paint it. So I'm excited to see what they do. And yeah, looking forward to getting more updates to you. There'll be a link to this particular drawing if you're interested in the description of the video. So you'll have access to that if you find that helpful. The first initial thing I'm looking at is what basing material am I going to use for this project. Now, I considered a bunch of options. There, the price tag you saw, that's for 1/2 inch. MDF, 4 feet by 8 feet, which is actually what I end up going with. It's 1/2 inch thick. I think the thickness is really kind of perfect for this project. It's unlikely to warp in my mind, and it's not terribly heavy, especially the piece I'm going to end up working with. Now, there are a few other options here, and I'm looking down the aisles at Home Depot, and I see the tempered hardboard, which I do use for certain projects, and this also comes in a 4 foot by 8 foot section. It's a lot cheaper. It is a lot thinner as well. It might even be less than 1/4 inch, but it's in that ballpark. I was concerned that the hardboard would warp, considering I was going to be working with a larger piece than I usually would use that type of material for a project. Now, the MDF has a few pros to it and it has a few cons. And I'm by no means an expert, but I have a working knowledge of it. And it is a lot cheaper than plywood, for example. So getting a 1/2 inch MDF compared to like 1/2 inch plywood, the MDF is significantly cheaper, which is obviously a big check mark in the pros column here. However, it is heavier. It is going to produce more sawdust when you cut it. It's a lot messier to work with. So you have a weight issue. You have also a messy issue as you're cutting it. But in my experience, it also tends to stay a little bit flatter, if that makes sense, more level. It's less prone to just warping, whether that's warping while working with it, warping just while storing it. Than I think plywood is. And I think just off the rack, a sheet of MDF is going to be a little flatter than a sheet of plywood. But I think both will work fine. You know, I considered plywood, but it is really expensive right now. And I think for this project, MDF was just making more sense. Home Depot, as I'm sure your big box hardware store does as well, has some pre-cut plywood. Most of these are 2 feet by 2 feet. Some of them were 2 feet by 4 feet. So if you're going to go with that because it's convenient or you don't feel comfortable cutting the wood, it's a good option. And then you can just scale your model to fit your base. All right, so most Home Depots and big box hardware stores have a cutting station. Now, you don't do the cutting, one of the employees does. And I have found from experience that if you find the guy with the biggest, bushiest mustache, he tends to be the guy that makes the most accurate cuts. So look for him, sweet talk him. Usually they're willing to make 3 or 4 cuts for you. And have your projects in mind when you're getting these cuts. I don't just get a cut to fit in the car, but have your project in mind. So like for this, I knew I needed one side that was going to be 33 inches long, and I had 33 inches cut right on the very first cut. So I knew, okay, one of my cuts is already done for this project, and I'll just do the cross cut. So all the steps that involve using a particularly sharp utensils, I'm going to do, and I'm not going to let the students do that. So that would include pre-cutting the cardboard pieces. So what I did was, using my drawing, I determined essentially every piece that I would need for the build, and I, as accurately as I could, cut every single piece that would be needed for the frame of the castle build. Now, none of this will be visible when the project's done. We're going to cover all this with stones and woodwork for the doorways and all of that. But these are all the walls for the tower that you're seeing now, and they're all flush. They're all pre-cut. Now, when I combine them, I'll need to trim 2 of them a little bit so that they remain to be square. Those will be the top platforms for the towers. So every single piece for the castle is already cut. And this is good, and they're also labeled. So students can then assemble them. So the students are definitely able to do the assembly, and that's where the initial student step is going to come in, assembling all these pieces using the blueprint, and then I'll be there to answer questions and help and kind of do some direction, but the students can kind of take over in the construction phase of this. And I'll show you a few of the larger pieces here. This is the main walls of the bottom platform, which is going to be the largest portion of the castle. So all the pieces are pre-cut, ready to go, ready to be put together, and ready for students to jump in. Here is a quick tip for cutting cardboard, or really any material with a carpenter's square. Even with the square, I found as I was working on projects, it wasn't perfectly square, which was super frustrating to me. And finally, I figured out the trick that just made the most sense to me. I would cut it, and it would be just slightly off. And of course, just being off, 1/8 of an inch is a big deal over a long cut. But once I started using the second square, then the magic really started to happen here, because I would line it up in the front, line it up in the back, same marks. So if it's 4 inches in the front, 4 inches in the back, and that's where I started to get perfectly square cuts. Now, I'm not a carpenter, I'm a history teacher, so there's probably other ways to do this, but that is what worked for me. And if you've had this problem in the past, it might work wonders for you. To help students put together pieces in a 90-degree angle, I made a jig here by laminating 2 pieces of scrap material together and making sure that I laminated them in a perfect 90-degree jig. All right, now it's time to make the stones. How many stones do I need for this project? A metric crap ton, I think, is the answer. I could do a bunch of math and figure it out, but I figured instead of wasting time doing math, let's just make stones. So I'm making stones that are 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch. And I think that this will work well with the measurements of the castle. Now, granted, once you get into the project, sometimes these things don't work out perfectly, but with all the measurements of the castle, if my stones are 1/2 inch in length, it should be perfect, right? They should go all the way around the perimeter without needing any partial stones. Now, I know that's not going to work out that way because even in the texturing process, I'm changing the dimensions of the stones. But that's the idea in mind, is that these will look good. They're small, right? So it's actually kind of critical, I think, for a project this size to either be really patient because it's going to take a long time, or have 150 people working on it. So obviously in this case, I'm going with the 150 people working on it method, which the laborious part of gluing on individual stones. And you can, of course, draw the stones on the foam, although I have never been able to draw them on the foam in a way that looked as good as individual stones. Now, I've seen some other people do it, and their methods and their finished product looks great. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying from my experience, I've always felt like it looks better with individual stones. Now, the other caveat to that is using a hot wire cutter, I think, is really helpful. Now, you can cut the foam with a knife, but especially on bulk projects like this, I think you really want a hot wire cutter. I use the Proxxon, and I'll put a link in the description. If you've never used it before, Black Magic Craft channel has a great tutorial and review of it, and it's where I learned about the Proxxon in general. So check that out if you're interested. It is a little bit of an investment. It's not a cheap tool, but if you're going to make a lot of terrain, I think it's pretty useful. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing these stones is I'm mass producing these things. I'm just starting with some big pieces of foam. These are 2-inch thicks, insulation foam, the XPS foam that you can get at Home Depot and other stores. I think in my experience, you want the pink foam. Sometimes I've seen it in blue. I've seen other crafters on YouTube have it in green, but in my experience, for the local stores that I see, it's the pink foam. It's not like the bubbly foam that you get in, like if you buy a TV, it's not that kind of styrofoam. It is different. So be mindful of that, and you can see other videos where they explain the different types of foam. but it's the XPS foam. And I'm cutting it. This starting block was roughly like 20 inches by 6 inches by 2 inches. And I'm just doing strips that are 1/4 inch wide. And I'm making as many of them as I can. And then once I'm done with this block of foam, I'm going to gather up stacks of the foam and then run it through again. So I'll have essentially little sticks that are about 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 6 inch. Then I changed my setting to 1/2 inch on the wire cutter and grab bundles of those sticks and running them through horizontally. And this will give me my final product, individual stones that are 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch. All right, and finally I end up with a huge stack of these stones. I pile them into a container. My family helped out by eating the biscotti. And yeah, I repeat this several more times, making a ton of these small stones. I live in Central California, and I find Home Depot to be the best store to find this pink insulation foam. If you're lucky, you can find it in the 2-inch thick. My local store only has it in the 1-inch thick, but your stores might vary. Texturing this many stones can be a lot of work. So this is a trick I picked up from Black Magic Craft, but having a tin can that's filled with a bunch of bolts and odd chunks of metal. You could fill it with pebbles as well. But essentially, you're just adding the stones in with these rough-shaped objects that are sturdy, and you're going to shake it up as those rough objects are hitting the small stones, the pink foam, and it will round off the edges. It will cause indentations, and they'll look more stone-like. The reason I added the sheet of the bounce on laundry sheet that I never use, but Mrs. Traveling Dice says is really important, is because there's a huge amount of static normally. So I had actually never done this before, and this was just an experiment here, but it actually worked really well. Normally these stones will stick to the side of the can, they will stick to your hand, they will stick to the table. So this was effective. It was, though, surprisingly messy. So a lot of debris came off of that sheet. So I did end up hitting the area with a shop vac. So I would have that handy because, yeah, you probably don't want to be inhaling that. I'm not a doctor, but I feel pretty confident that inhaling whatever's coming out of this is not good. So if you're going to use that method, I think I would wear a mask and then hit the area with the shop vac right after. But yeah, super effective. And the interesting thing is I noticed that even after I did future batches and didn't add the bounce sheet, it kind of carried over and the amount of static was reduced even after not including it, which was super cool. But if you don't mind the static, you can get by without it. You just have to be hitting the can and knocking them out. And it's totally doable, and especially if, like in my case, I'm having students do this. All the students can just deal with the static. That'll, something that make it challenging for them, and that's perfectly fine. But I just do this for a test run here just to demonstrate, but I'm having the students actually do this process during lunchtime and stepping out during class time and getting these stones ready. I do want to include some options here in case you don't have the hot wire cutter and you don't maybe have access to the foam, or you're going to go a different route because you don't have the hot wire cutter. I think there's other great options to make a cool castle and have some stone-like texture. And you could simply do this with cardboard, all right? So you can cut cereal box strips and then just cut them into rectangles and actually just glue those on with maybe a small gap in between. I think this is a fine option, and when painted up, I actually think this will look great. Here at Traveling Dice Manor, we actually eat a lot of eggs, which is cool. They're healthy and they're delicious, and they come in a cool container that actually I think can serve some terrain purposes if you're looking for rock substitutes. If you buy in bulk, like I tend to, then they oftentimes come with these like sheets of, I don't really know what they're called, but foam, cardboard foamish. They have a rocky texture. They're not smooth at all. They have great texture. I think they would take paint really well. So here in this instance, I just ripped off a piece, kind of flattened it out, and then I'm just cutting that into rectangles. Now, granted, this is going to be pretty laborious, so I don't think it's any faster. Similar texture here as you're looking at the cup holders that come from various fast food restaurants or Starbucks. And yeah, setting stuff like this aside, I think, is cool for terrain projects. Now, if you're making a lot of stones, again, you're talking about putting in some time, but it does give you a few alternatives if you're looking to go a different route other than foam. And again, just cutting them into the shapes you want for your stones, and you could just then be gluing them on. And it's also a great means of recycling some of these materials that might otherwise be just discarded. If you enjoyed the video and you know someone else who would, please consider sharing it with them. And tune in next week as we actually start to do some assembly and go vertical with this project. See you next week. Bye for now.